me. And yeah, feel free to get in touch after this via Twitter or via my email. I'm happy to respond to questions on email, and I've got a couple of my papers at the end. If you wanted a copy of any of those, email me and I can get that to you. So my role this morning really is to set the scene. In some ways, I feel like when I come to these, I'm preaching to the converted. So you're here, you're probably way more expert in dealing with older clients and with diverse clients than I am. I'm not a practitioner, although I do practice as a mediator, and I do run elder mediations for family, mostly dealing with family conflict around wills and estates or care plans, whether family are going to go into a care home or something along those lines. But my role this morning is just to emphasize why you should be here, why you should tell your colleagues about what you've learnt today, and why as a profession we need to get better at this. So just putting today's talk in, the different talks from experts today in that sort of educational context, and to paint a little picture about where the law is going in this respect as well. I always sort of feel bad kind of telling you, not bad, but I know that you know this, that we have an aging population. And in some ways this is a redundant slide, but what I want to just emphasize is what that aging population actually means, and some sort of details about the diversity. So although we often talk about an aging population, but I think particularly in the elder law and financial planning space, we also need to think about diversity within the aging population. So you'll sometimes hear about the old, the older, and the very old. So rather than thinking of older people as one big sort of cardboard cutout client, for us to be thinking more and more about diversity within aging clients and understanding and being able to respond to that diversity. So you can see there that second point, that the number of people aged 85 years and over has increased by 125% in the last 20 years, compared with a total population growth of 34.3%. It's a very stark statistic, I think, about the trajectory of our population and what that might mean for practitioners. At the same time, there's a lot of scaremongering about dementia. People are more scared of dementia than they are of cancer. But it's not going to affect every older person, and we can't treat all older people as though they have a cognitive impairment. Around 27, only 27% of those receiving care at home have dementia. But in aged care in nursing home facilities, that rate rises to around 50%. And in the very old age group within aged care facilities, it's much, much higher than that. And I think that for some, particularly older practitioners, in my research that I've seen, so my research was around the capacity complaints at the Office of Legal Services Commission. So I spent a year looking through their files. I was very privileged to have access to that, and all of the complaints that were raised about how lawyers had assessed the legal decision-making capacity of older people. And what sometimes came through was that older practitioners who had that experience of nursing home care, where there was a huge diversity of cognition within the nursing home population, but now that all of the government policies are trying to push people to live at home for longer, the demographic within nursing homes has changed quite a bit. So there are much more complex needs within nursing homes, much more high care needs, and cognition is definitely an issue, particularly for the older clients there. We're going to start, I think we're not there yet, but we're going to start seeing more and more research and more details about older people and their diversity. So at the moment, there's still perhaps a resonance from some older clients to, for instance, identify as being part of a same-sex couple, but that's changing. We need to remember in terms of cultural diversity of older people. and have an understanding of that, so that when we're interviewing an older person for whom English is a second language, we've got the skills to deal with that in the same way that we have the skills to deal with somebody for whom English is their first language. And that we would develop that sort of knowledge that language skills can be one of the things to go in particular forms of dementia. And I'm sure you all know that. But we don't get a lot of training in how to identify those issues, how to work with interpreters, the kinds of accommodations that you need to assist people in those conversations. And that's something that as a profession, I think we need to work on as well. A lot of the work that's happening in Australia, we're one of the leaders in terms of supported decision-making models. And very recently, the UN's comments on our report to the CRPD committee emphasised that the way that Australia is going in terms of supported decision-making is probably going to be followed around the world. And that's to say that Australia recognises that there is a need to support people in decision making, not to have a bright line approach that says you either have capacity or you don't have capacity, but learning to support people to make their decisions. This comes from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Article 12 that says that everybody has a right to legal personality, and along with that comes the right to make legal decisions. But it also recognizes, and that those decisions should respond to that person's will and preference, not their best interests. And that's a big shift in terms of the culture of decision making across the world for people with disabilities and for older people as well with cognitive impairments, and something we need to be able to explain to family members. It's not what son or daughter thinks is in mum and dad's best interests, let alone son and daughter's best interests. The decision should be based on the older person's will and preference. But at the same time, we need to safeguard older people from abuse, particularly from abuse from other family members, from conflict between siblings. And I'm sure you all have experienced that situation where a health problem, financial difficulties or financial uncertainty can create conflict amongst families. And I know that's one of the big things that you're dealing with. So how do you refer people to resolve that conflict? Do you know about elder mediation services? Are you aware of the support that's around for family members? Because supporting the family members will help your clients, because no one makes good decisions when they're in the midst of a terrible conflict. I know I don't, and certainly if you're also battling health problems and problems around dementia or otherwise, it makes it even harder. That very recent report from the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities made a recommendation to the whole of the world to ensure that training modules on working with persons with disabilities and the Convention are incorporated into mandated training programs for police officers, prison officers, lawyers, judicial officers, judges and court staff. I know that in New South Wales the Judicial Commission is implementing this sort of training, and I recently reviewed a new chapter for them on working with older people as part of their judicial bench book. And it's great to see the College of Law supporting events like today to further that purpose. As some of you will know, we've had a few major Law Reform Commission reports that deal with people with cognitive impairment and also deal with the issue of elder abuse. And both of those reports led to recommendations that, like this one. So recommendation 8, that the Law Council of Australia, together with state and territory law societies, should develop national best practice guidelines for legal practitioners in relation to the preparation and execution of wills and other advanced planning documents to ensure they provide thorough coverage of matters such as elder abuse in probate matters, common risk factors associated with undue influence, the importance of taking detailed instructions from the person alone, the need to keep detailed file notes and make inquiries regarding previous wills and advanced planning documents, and the importance of ensuring that the person has testamentary capacity, understanding the nature of the document and knowing and approving of its contents, particularly in circumstances where an unrelated person benefits. So that's one of the slides in your pack as well. All of these are in there. But these kinds of recommendations are slowly filtering down, and eventually they'll make their way, I hope, into accreditation materials for specialists and into law school curriculums. We tend to teach law, and you will possibly experience this yourselves, as though we have cardboard clients. We don't actually talk about the people behind cases very often. We teach precedent without discussing who that precedent affects and how it affects them, and the role of lawyers in assisting people or financial planners in assisting to deal with those effects. And so I know that, again, there'll be people today talking about a different approach to professional services and dealing with clients more holistically. But I just want to set the scene of where are these moves coming from. I come from a law school, so I'm very focused on, and I teach legal ethics, so I'm quite focused on the professional rules. Rule 8, a solicitor must follow a client's lawful, proper, and competent instructions. So how do we know when our client is competent to give those instructions? And do we know how to assist them in that to maximize their competence? So rather than deciding whether they're competent or incompetent, how do we make sure that we interview them in the best possible conditions to really improve their decision-making capacity? That we interview them somewhere where they're comfortable, that we interview them where they're somewhere away from undue influence. And there's research to show that they can be influenced, they can experience influence in their decision-making by the person who took them to the appointment, even if that person isn't in the room. So are we aware of that kind of research and the subtle ways that undue influence can impact our clients? And of course, as far as lawyers go, there is a Victorian case about capacity negligence. So the lawyers in this situation were found negligent for taking instructions to settle a matter when their client didn't have decision-making capacity. In that situation, the client was suffering from a very severe depression. So do we recognize that it's not just a diagnosed, sort of recognized thing like dementia that can, different forms of dementia that can impact people's decision making, but mental health problems, drug and alcohol problems? Can we identify those? Do we ask questions about those things of our clients? And again, support them as much as we can in developing their decision-making capacity. I'm sure you all know this, but just to emphasize, there's no single test for capacity. It's decision specific. So the decision-making capacity to write a complicated will that involves trusts and a significant estate is more difficult, requires, I guess, if there was such a thing as a capacimeter, which there isn't, requires more decision-making ability than to write a very simple will if your estate just comprises your house and your children aren't fighting with one another and everyone's happy with the idea that it's 50-50. That's a simple decision compared to making that will for a more complicated estate. We have this concept, and it's a problematic one, I think, in terms of fluctuating capacity. What does that mean? And are we talking about people whose decision-making capacity is affected because of some sort of infection, for instance, and that once that infection's resolved, their decision-making is going to return? That's one thing. But the idea that someone with a moderate or severe dementia would have some huge amount of capacity in the morning that they don't have in the afternoon, I think is problematic. And people need to understand, I think, a little bit more about the trajectory of dementia, and some forms of dementia in particular. And I think if I was to encourage very experienced practitioners in terms of further education, it would be around doing something like the Wicking Institute's MOOC on dementia. So a massive online course that runs out of UTAS. It's a really great free course that will really develop your knowledge about the impact of different of aging on the brain and how it can affect decision making in different forms. So there are some great resources out there, and we need to make use of those. I've got details about that on the last slide. As I said, my own research, I guess it's sort of at the dark end of the spectrum. Rogue lawyers, lawyers whose skills are weren't necessarily good, about whom complaints were made about their capacity assessment. But the interesting thing about looking at these files is that, as well as all of the lawyers' files, as part of the complaints, I very often had access to the medical files as well, and to all of the documents that the complainant and the other side had prepared as well around these disputes. And as you can imagine, a lot of them were about powers of attorney, about testamentary capacity, and about enduring guardianship. And a lot of them boiled down to family conflict over money, bottom line. But there were lawyers within those files who were whose practice was, for instance, to say, well, I knew that the person had capacity to make a will because I read the will to them, and then I said, do you understand? And they said yes. But equally, there were doctors who said, I knew this person had capacity because they were bright as a button. It has nothing to do with the person's legal decision-making capacity, but they hadn't been properly briefed by the lawyer about what was the legal decision, what were the elements of that decision, what did that lawyer need to know about that older person's decision-making ability in order to understand whether they had legal decision-making capacity or not. Very often it was statements like that one there, I was able as usual to have a fairly normal conversation with her and her answers were appropriate. She was able to tell me all about her favourite television programs, her piano playing, and I'd be sitting at my desk reading through these going, yes, but what could she tell you about making an enduring guardianship decision? Why didn't you ask her about that? You know, he actually carried a chair from one room to another. I don't care if he could carry a chair. Could he make a legal decision? So just that understanding that the way a person presents doesn't always tell you anything about their legal decision-making capacity. But do we have good relationships with qualified, experienced medical professionals who can make these kind of assessments and help you? And that's a sort of interdisciplinary work that we need to be doing, and the kind of interdisciplinary education that's really lacking in medical schools, in accounting schools, in law schools, how to work with other professionals. And I think like one of the most important skills is humility, knowing what you don't know and finding out who else can help you to get there is one of the key skills for people working in this space, and something I hope that you'll experience today, learning about some experts that are out there and some of the great resources that are out there to help you. I'm not going to talk about these cases, but these are just some of the disciplinary matters. The list is on your paper. In most of these situations, these lawyers did a poor capacity assessment around making enduring powers of attorney or enduring guardianship, with devastating consequences for their clients. Losses in some cases of millions of dollars. Sometimes putting people at risk of homelessness. Definitely creating, you know, much worse conflict within their family, and I suspect hastening their death, to be quite frank, because these kinds of conflicts really do have devastating health effects as well as financial effects on clients. I love to follow Justice Lindsay's decisions. Being a law nerd, I have alerts for when his decisions come up. This is a reasonably recent one. And I just thought that little quote kind of really got to the message that I think all of the experts here would have, in a sense. So instead of convening a family conference at which different perspectives could be shared and conflicting narratives exposed to mature reflection, with completing claims to management of family property made the subject of informal negotiation, both wife and husband took to the law. It's a sad indictment that taking to the law would be seen as, you know, adopting battle positions, when taking to the law should mean receiving mature professional advice about how to resolve those conflicts, whether you're a financial planner or a lawyer. So I just really want to emphasize that what we're talking about today, it's a human rights approach. It's about helping to prevent elder abuse and maintain people's health. It's about understanding the importance of good referral skills, knowing who to refer to, understanding the difference between a psychologist, a neuropsychologist, a gerontologist, a GP, a physiotherapist, who can all offer something. And depending on your client's needs, you might need any one of those people. So understanding all of the different professions that are involved in this. Understanding details about aging and cognition, good communication skills, conflict resolution skills, client diversity, and most of all, humility, knowing what we don't know, because none of us know everything and we've all got a lot to learn. So I hope today is going to be an experience like that, where you learn things and you meet some people who know stuff you don't know. And that's it from me.
Good morning, everybody. 750,000 years ago, the origins of human beings might be starting to be charted with our predecessors of humanoids. 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, as we would understand them, seem to have appeared. The Neolithic revolution began 12,000 years ago and ran through about 7,000. In that period, you have animal husbandry, you have agriculture, you have subsequently the invention of writing. And a lot of what I'm talking about today is about record keeping, writing. It was in the 11th century AD now that you have the invention of the concept of common law, meaning following precedent. And that's something I learned from this magnificent book I read many years ago, The Electronic Media and the Transformation of Law by Ethan Karsh. I'll repeat the title, The Electronic Media and the Transformation of Law. Anybody want to have a guess when this book was published? Pick a year. 1960? I'm glad that you were very aggressive. It's 1989.
I was working on them.
The first legal report, meaning the gathering together of legal decisions in England, was in 1537, which is, of course, when printing has just started. Then an amazing thing happened in world history. In the 17th century, you had the scientific revolution. In the scientific revolution, something happened that really changed a lot of things. One of those things was the introduction of the word fact across European languages. The word fact didn't virtually exist before then. Together with that came the scientific method. The best book I've read in the last 5 years is this one by David Wootton. He's an English historian, and it's called The Invention of Science. So when you look at that scientific revolution of the 17th century, you're reminded of something that pretty much laid the groundwork for what was known as the Industrial Revolution, which of course begins in the 18th century. It's in the 18th century that you have Blackstone's commentaries on the far left. Blackstone was a lawyer who pulled together a 4-volume work summarising the laws as they were then known. And when I went to law school, the middle book was a popular text, Osborne's Concise Law Dictionary in 1927. It built on prior books. But here we have a book that all law students could use and find these key words. Words are what law is about. Words are what knowledge is about. So gathering together those words and creating a system of meaning is one of the themes of what we're talking about today. So when I started as a lawyer in 1983, the organisation I worked for was Angus and Robinson Publishers. And one of the books they had just published was Michael Sexton's Legal Mystique. Michael Sexton's a very prominent academic. He was, I think, for a time Attorney General in New South Wales, and he was a lecturer at University of New South Wales. What he argued in that book, which had appropriately a black cover, was that lawyers, in a sense, were hiding behind hoods, that they had veils, that they were operating behind a mystique that wasn't warranted or useful. I certainly was aware of the fact that the law was operating under legal mystique, and since I was a bit of a snoop and had a long nose, I asked my boss, how did the book do? And he gave me a letter that Michael Sexton had written to him, complaining that the book had had such poor sales, and what appalling marketing the company had done. To which Richard replied, "You're ahead of the market. Nobody was really that interested. We did our best." Now, in the noughties, the 2000 and onward period, there was a dramatic change in writing and record keeping, because what Web 2.0 technologies did from 2003 in America, 2006 thereafter in Australia, is they permitted people to go onto a computer and type as if they're typing ordinary English, but in fact they were typing HTML. And so that led to further explosions in information. Now, what have we learned so far from what's been said? Well, one of the things I want to put down as a stake in the ground is that common belief systems are what human history has in various periods. Those belief systems change. I believe economics plays a key role in making those shifts occur. When the economics change, often there's technologies that make them change. I've mentioned animal husbandry, agriculture, you've already guessed computers are there, printing is there, and the recording of information and the way it's delivered actually affects the information itself. And that's a core realisation when you read Karsh's book, because what he's talking about, among many things, but the core thing he's talking about in this book is the transformation of law that occurred because of printing. He points out that in England, in the early part of the medieval period, judges could make their decisions based on common sense and their understanding orally of what the law should be. But when the cities in England grew in their size, if you got a decision in one city that was different to another city, people started to talk. People started to lose respect in the law. If the law can be that varied, then it can't be law. And so judges got into the habit, he points out, of lending each other the vellum scrolls, the animal skin scrolls, where they'd written notes of the facts of a matter and how they come to a conclusion. And it's those recordings that you find, as I mentioned earlier, in about 1530, end up becoming a book, and then you have these authorised books. Well, when I went to university, there was one fellow in a room, and we said, "What does that guy do?" And this is like 1980, and they said, "Oh, he's feeding into a computer. It's like dog bites man, and he's trying to find any case that relates to dog bites man." Didn't mean anything at the time. Now, of course, the very medium in which law is recorded, which is electronic, affects the way we find law, affects the fact that other people can find the law, other people have views on the law, and as in medicine, people use Dr. Google. People use Dr. Google in law. And that makes the general population a little bit like what the Englishmen were 1,000 years ago, when the judges in different cities were making different decisions, and yet the law seemed to be somewhat different. We are only 300 generations away from the moment of writing. There are 2 generations between now and, say, 2050. Yet the pace of change currently, and you can see the contraction of time in the history that I've told, the contraction of time means that between 2020, next year, 2050 is 30 years. That's actually one generation. And yet we are in a situation where our economic systems, our political systems, even our cultural systems, I would argue, are not ready for what is about to hit them. What happened with a lot of the professions is that they emerged from the medieval era and became industrialised in the 19th century. So the process of industrialisation, and we'll just focus on England, the process of industrialisation is in part what results in the accounting profession in the late 19th century. It didn't always exist. Judges, as I've read, were complaining about the fact that accountants kept turning up to cases and having completely different views as to how to measure things with numbers. And they insisted that there's got to be some standardisation. So those who called themselves accountants grouped together, formed institutions, and then said, right, we're going to follow a common standard. 100 years on, and Michael Perkins and I were at a seminar in Adelaide 2 weeks ago, where two people, one of whom had been practising accounting for 35 years, and the other one was an academic in accounting, basically said our profession of accounting doesn't add a lot of value anymore. And they were pointing to the differences between book value, as accountants are permitted under standards to record, versus market value, which the stock market might give to a product or an offering, and I would argue, versus what a private, unfloated, unlisted company might value itself. So that in that sector of knowledge, accounting, is facing a situation where the information recorded in different places represents very different things, very different outcomes, meaning the stock market, the book value, the standards you're supposed to apply, and the standards that startups apply to their value. You know, is Uber worth 78 billion? Now, what characterises professions? Well, it's been observed that there's a number of things that bind them together. They have tools of trade, which we might call specialised knowledge and experience. Experience is very important. What you learn academically and what you learn in practice build on each other. Professions have admission requirements. It's a credentialising approach, and credentialising has arguably, I was told in the 1990s by management consultants and more senior people than me, credentialising has gotten out of control. Okay? A third characteristic of professions is they have statutory regulations that mandate certain behaviours. As a lawyer, I believe the writing of law is insane. The way it's written, the way it's organised, it's insane. Okay? Ethics are also a characteristic of the professions, that each profession is expected to be bound by ethics. Why? Because law in itself doesn't actually provide the level of control that society values. And finally, mandatory insurance. It's another characteristic that the professions have. Now, in advanced societies that we are now in, facing issues that are gigantium, it seems that there are very few people that can fathom the level of the challenge, even in terms of how the profession should be reshaped, in terms of values, in terms of regulation, in terms of methodologies. It's a time when there's a decline, in fact, in trust in lawyers, trust in the professions, certainly a decline in trust in government. Shockingly, a decline in trust in news. So, at the same time, we are in a very unusual period. This is 2019. We have enormous churn in business. We have low interest, the lowest interest in 5,000 years. We have low inflation, stagnating wages, low growth, and a declining number of years of survival of businesses. And yet, of course, mass media that depends on advertising and governments that depend on votes will tell you it's all okay. It's okay, it's good, it's not bad at all. The best times ever. Dated offerings by me and my colleagues don't sell. We've already gone past the idea that all we do is law. my personal hero on this, and I must read about him one day, is Da Vinci. You know, 400 or 500 years ago, the man is a painter. He's slicing up human bodies and seeing how the anatomy is structured. He's an inventor. It's possible. He wasn't credentialed to do it. He had access to stuff. And this is before printing became en masse available. Here's a fascinating fact that you will find in David Wooden's book. It's an amazing fact. Okay, here we go. If you're an educated person in the year 1600, round figures, how many books do you think you'd have in your library?
5.
You have about 2 dozen. If you're an educated person in 1600, in 1700, 100 years later, about the end of the scientific revolution, about when Newton comes around in 1704 and has his amazing discoveries, 100 years later, you've gone from 24 books to how many books would you, if you're an educated person in Europe, how many books would you have there then?
200.
You would have about 2,000 in your collection. Think about it. Now, did society change because of that? Of course it did. So we are sitting here with supercomputers in our pockets, with access to enormous information. We're pretending that it's still the 19th century with its regulations of lawyers and other professions. Something's got to give, something's got to change. Law is an $800 billion profession globally. In the US, shoes as an industry are only 48 billion, just by way of comparison. Management consultancy is a profession that emerges from about 100 years ago, round figures 1900. Exploded in the 1960s because of the complexity of particularly American companies and their structures and their global activities. So you had big names like Bain and Company, Boston Consulting, McKinsey. Those names have shrunk and their knowledge has shrunk and the usefulness of their knowledge has shrunk as the access to information became more available. They used to, according to many commentators, used to sell what they'd researched. They were selling what they researched. 80% of their time was collecting information and delivering it to the corporation saying, look what we found. Now, they shrunk. Why? Because that information is more available. And so Deloitte, KPMG, EY, PwC, they have taken over these professions and their markets enormously. So management consultancy is a shrinking profession from what I have seen in my lifetime. We can argue whether that's the case or not. So in the 1990s, when these books that are on your screen were around, I was learning to be a management consultant through osmosis. I was in an office where there were many people who were formerly working in Treasury in Canberra, or who had been marketing consultants or HR consultants, and I learned a lot, because it's just knowledge, it's information. I shared mine about law, they shared theirs about management consultancy. The law books that were published about law as a profession, making sense of law firms, is in the middle there. It's an exceptional book, because the English author there looked at the structure of law firms and how they ingest facts, how they process facts, how they structure themselves internally. It was a management consultancy book about law firms. And David Meister, the yellow book on the far right, wrote several books which were about professionalism and how to be professional. If I look back at those books now, I see them as actually being about a time that's passed, because the next series of books that we saw a lot of were about the impact of information technology. So on your screen you see books by Richard Susskind and then his son on the far right. And they are really very often books that look at the impact of information and talk about the fact that the business models of lawyers need to change because of that. The business models of accountants have changed because of information. The availability of QuickBooks, Xero and online accounting systems have taken enormous amounts of work that accountants used to do and bookkeepers used to do. It's industrialised it. So they have to find new things to do. Lawyers are the same. And as a consequence, you find a lot of lawyers who will do things that are out of their scope because they have a lack of work. So one of the things that, in coming to my conclusions, one of the things I want to emphasise, and it's really the concluding theme, is the multidisciplinary nature of knowledge and the multidisciplinary nature of the delivery of knowledge that's required. In the 1990s, one of my mentors in management consultancy told me about an aphorism about how 5 different professions in the health and allied professions would handle the problem. And he talked about a nurse, a general practitioner, a psychologist, a pharmacist, and a brain surgeon. So he said, have you heard this one? Right. So he said, a patient goes to a nurse, and the nurse says, are you okay, dear? Do you need some water? Puts her hand or his hand on the patient's body, consoles them, and the person feels better already. Certain things happen inside their brain, inside their body, that make them feel better. The same patient goes to a general practitioner, and the general practitioner pulls up the computer screen, looks at the last thing, measures the pumping of the blood, asks whether there have been recent symptoms, types away, writes notes, and 20 minutes later says, now go and see this person, or now go and see this other person and get this pill. So our patient goes to get the pill from the pharmacist that's next door. And the pharmacist says, what is it? Looks at the piece of screen, doesn't ask any questions, looks at the piece of paper, doesn't ask any questions, turns around, moves towards the wall, picks a bottle, comes back and gives you this pill and says, that'll make you feel better. And it does. The patient takes it and feels better. But the patient's still not feeling good. So the patient goes to a psychologist. And the psychologist says, excuse the cliche, lie down and tell me your problem. And the patient feels better, having left that building. But weeks later, talking to the nurse, talking to the general practitioner, talking to the psychologist, talking to the pharmacist, says, look, I still don't feel right. The conclusion is that patient must see a brain surgeon. The brain surgeon sees the patient for a little while, doesn't ask any of the questions that the others does, and says, come right in. Because basically, the brain surgeon just wants that body wheeled in to do the operation, and the job is done. So each of these professions is solving a problem, and yet they're interconnected. And a slide that I wish to put onto the screen, but in my rush yesterday it didn't land on the screen, is a slide that has 3 interconnecting circles, and this is my conclusion. And those 3 intersecting circles are that in the practice of law, in the delivery of services that we at Nexus, Michael and I included, we wish to do, the practice of law that we wish to do, begins with consulting. What's your problem? What type of problem do you have? We're a bit of a nurse. You know, oh, I'm not the right guy. Go to this person. We're a bit of a general practitioner. Go see that specialist. Oh, all you need is this one document. We're a bit of a pharmacist. Brain surgery, you need to see a barrister. It's a very expensive profession. So we begin with consultancy. Consultancy, I call myself, years ago I called myself a digital traffic cop, because I'm just manning a computer screen and you just tell me which way you want to go and I'll tell you which digits you should follow. Now, the second stage after the consultancy is advice. And advice is the delivery of opinion. Based on the facts that you've told me, based on what I've heard, based on maybe some other people have come back, the barrister included, and given some views, here's the advice. Let's talk about it. And ideally we want to see, if it's a really serious matter, we want to see you face to face. We want you to smell our pheromones. We want you to see our eyeballs moving. We want you to make a very careful decision. Yes, sometimes you can use Skype and you can use a telephone and whatever, but the meeting has a purpose. It is the highest form of human communication. When they invent a better thing than theatre and meetings, please come and tell me. So that second stage, as I say, is advice. Only when you take the advice as a client, as a patient, then you come back and you say, okay, I'm prepared to do that thing that you're saying. That's called a transaction. So, in conclusion, the professions should learn from Da Vinci. They should learn from the multiple areas of knowledge that are out there, because the patients and the clients already have some access to that. What they're seeking from you is your ability to pull together knowledge from very different areas and to deliver it in a way that gives them assurance that you're doing your very best. That's when you do the transaction. Yes, it's true. Sometimes a transaction is all you need, and it's very clear from your experience that's the main thing to go to. You can reduce or eliminate the need for lengthy consultancy or lengthy advice and race to the transaction. But too often, people have this perception that the history of law did not end with Hammurabi, the ruler of Mesopotamia, did not end with the Ten Commandments, and did not end with the Roman 12 tablets. And what was the characteristics of those 3 laws? They were written in stone. No, we've stopped that. It's not that permanent. Law is very malleable. It's digital. And so consequently, this pulling together of different knowledge is the conclusion I've come to, meaning a multidisciplinary approach to solving also the needs of the people as they age. Thank you very much. I had dinner, or lunch rather, with Anthony about 5 years ago, and we had a nice chat. And Anthony's an IT lawyer and an IP lawyer, and a former president of the Australian Computer Society, which has over 40,000 members. And 5 years ago, it was like an introductory conversation. So when we met again 3 weeks ago, I made a fool of myself, meaning ignorance I displayed. I said to Anthony, you know, it's really quite remarkable in all these years when there are things like aeroplane crash documentaries on TV, they always pick on the hairline crack on a bolt or a nut. They never talk about software. And Anthony said, no, they're talking about software now. How is that so, Anthony?
We were talking about the Boeing 737 MAX and how instead of changing the design of the wingspan to accommodate the new jet engine, they decided to use software to compensate, and that led to the disastrous crash of 2 aeroplanes. So I think the question now is, we've got to be thinking carefully about how we use software to do things around the world, including with artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. So I think this is one of the things we'd like to discuss in this panel today.
We also discussed the robo-debt issue in our lunch, and last week I noticed that there is actually a class action against the federal government, meaning when these people receive the phone calls from the computer alleging, or communications out of the computer alleging that they had received certain welfare payments that they shouldn't have received, the programming of those letters, the selection of who should receive them, wasn't apparently what it should have been. So obviously a lot of older people, a lot of people that are challenged in one way or another, were affected by this software error. This is kind of interesting because I read last week that in India and China, people would rather be judged by a robot than be judged by their boss.
Thank you, NORIC. 2 years ago, as president of the Australian Computer Society, I wrote in the Australian column on this particular issue with the robot debt. So when it first hit the media, I questioned about our ability to cope with, obviously, automation and the right of citizens to have decisions made by government without human intervention. So now with heating this media now, the Labor government is suing the department on class action. So we've seen a lot of documentaries on television, including on ABC, and a lot of columns have been written. I think it's a reflection of where we're heading down, NORIC. We've got, as I said, with the Boeing case, we've got to think about, before we automate things, we've got to think about what perspective and what environment are we putting those things into. What are we actually doing? In the robot case, they actually average the tax filing of the individual to then determine their welfare needs over a period. But the question to me as a technologist as well as a lawyer would be, is past data of yourself or the individual necessarily be a prediction of what's going to happen to you in the future? And this is very basic. Does the reflection of what you did in the past reflect that you're going to need welfare in the future? What if something hits you and you have an unfortunate circumstance? Your circumstances do change. So averaging your tax filing over the years, how would that reflect your needs for the future? So these are some of the, I think, some of the big question items that we need to ponder about. I think the Human Rights Commission has done a white paper, and they've subsequently done another paper on emerging technology and human rights. And I think some of these questions that you've raised, NORIC, just as two fundamental questions this morning, is going to come again and again over the next number of years as we debate, rage, discuss some of these fundamentals about our rights as humans, whether it's in an aging society or in a community, and over what we should be thinking about before we deploy technology.
A reflection on that, if I might. I think just that example just highlights that as citizens, we have an escalating amount of data. We are a data set of interest to government, industry, and others. As a society, we aren't enabling our ability as individuals to manage that data set terribly well. And yet it's a complexity that we are challenged by. So when we're looking at social outcomes, which at the high level of government policy get lashed up to wonderful, laudable objectives of empowering people to stay safely at home, to empower their interaction with society and the economy. What's not being talked about is by what infrastructure, by what steps, by what processes will people be able to more effectively manage the data that defines their personality on which government and corporate decisions are made. If you go into your Toyota dealer and you want to buy a car, more often than not, the decision to whether or not you'll be get credit will be a decision of an AI-based decision-making system of one particular kind. It won't use
The challenge with this that I've particularly picked up from Anthony, the conversation with you 2 weeks ago, the challenge is the one that you've actually, just to make it a bit clearer, because I think that's the point, and that is that the ability to audit how something is programmed is coming to the fore. The more software reliant a society becomes, the greater our ability to audit the writing of software has to be.
The problem, NORIC, is... Sorry.
I was just asking, are we taking questions? And so as I'm listening to this, the question's forming in my mind, and it's sort of born of my own experience. Because this is very interesting, tying back to the question of competency and people as they age and how they are going to be interacting with services, instrumentalities, and making decisions based upon information that's available to them. My own journey was introducing my mother in her 80s to the concept of a smartphone. And fortunately, she's still able to be switched on and was able to do so. So my question is, in the context of the way that this technology is evolving, what does that mean as far as education and accessibility for people? And maybe as we move through the generations, the digital natives won't have as much of a challenge, but certainly we have a wave of people who are moving through into that arena who aren't digital natives, haven't grown up with that. So what does this all mean as far as improving access for those people to the platforms to be able to get to all of the information that's now available where they don't need the 2,000 books on the shelf?
Seems that I'm the target. Just going back to your first question, NORIC, about software and decision making. Unfortunately, it's not as clear-cut as just software writing anymore. It's not just about writing code, because with artificial intelligence, it's actually learning from data, just like a baby's learning from input data from the parents and the schools, etc., etc. So the interesting phenomena is what data is that autonomous systems or artificial intelligence learning that is later going to use to predict or forecast or make decisions about you. So that is the interesting part. And because sometimes we cannot control what AI autonomous systems are learning, this is called unsupervised learning, how can then we be assured that the right decision was made on our behalf? So I think this is the big ticket item coming in the 21st and the 22nd century. And back to what Mark said about design. Right now, I think since the last couple of years, there's a huge consciousness now about, in the United Nations Forum, in the World Forum, discussion about accessibility. And they use the word accessibility. Just last week in Ukraine, I was participating with my colleagues working in the international space about what should IT professionals have in terms of values when they go about designing systems. Because traditionally, IT professionals were trained in vertical silos about technology. And apart from usually about ethics, most of them are pretty white in the younger age group. They're not familiar with the needs of the aging society or people with disabilities. So right now, the question, the debate around the world, including the European Union, with some of my colleagues in the European Union, is about how do we ingrain some of these values, both in the education of these IT developers and professionals, so that they are aware of those values when they go about designing, developing these systems. And how do we ensure that we have processes and systems in place to ensure that those values are indeed instilled in those things? So I'm very glad to say we've moved beyond in terms of ethics debate on AI, emerging technology, just the framework alone. We're now moving to the next step, which is how do we go about implementing some of these values when we're actually drafting, designing the user interface, the actual deployment of some of these autonomous systems into the marketplace. And apart from the many standards, which I won't have time to report to you, and the thousands of people who's working on this subject across the world, I'm glad to say that the world's waking up to this, that there is a need. 1 in 7 people in the world, from one of the stats that I've seen, will be over 65 by 2020. 1 in 7 billion. So that's a lot of people in terms of providing products and services to. That's a lot of people in terms of looking at their needs, in terms of visually impaired, mentally not as bright as when they were in their 20s. Be able to hear about what was said. So there are range of aging conditions that developers and designers need to think about when they go about doing those things. So this is really a summary snapshot. Obviously, there's a wealth of information behind what I've said, but just like the time, happy to canvas some of that later in this.
Yeah, perhaps we can go to questions if anybody does have questions.
I think the context of AI is really important in finance, one issue is that, for example, AMP has come out in the last couple of days saying Australians don't need human interaction; they can go directly to the computer and communicate and make decisions that way. In the context of impaired cognition or capacity, I daily have exposure to people who think they can, but there are restrictions in their life. One of those, for example, is somebody with who is very smart but is homeless, and they feel like the computer is a game, and they can manipulate the data input. So then the computer, for example, takes higher risk because they feel like they need to, which means obviously their investments or any investment decision making on behalf of this person is at a heightened risk. You know, they could be bipolar and they're having high or whatever. So in that context, what kind of barriers do we need to protect people who are taking excessive risks, and the computer doesn't really understand the full spectrum of their life?
I think this is going to be a theme which we'll repeat through the day. It's good. It's good. I think fundamentally this is the informed consent problem. I don't think we've yet designed a computer program that can actually assess informed consent. For the moment, I think it's the future is about the technology-augmented professional. I don't think that informed consent can be done by a computer system alone. However, once you've established the competence and ability of someone, then the computer has certainly got a role to facilitate the delivery of transactions and services. And what's really important in this is maintaining an understanding of the context of the client, because as Lisa said rightly in the first session, capacity and ability is decision and situation specific. So how are we going to provide support for individual decision making on a decision and situation specific basis without that person having access to appropriate professional support? I think we need to think of the role of professionals to be a decision support function, not just an advice and transaction function. And that's why consulting as a methodology of professional practice, I think, needs to be given greater focus. Carol.
I feel like one of the chicks has to say something. So what I was thinking of when you were talking about that, for that person, what's acceptable risk for them? And I think that's going to be one of the big things that we all grapple with. I know I'm from New South Wales Public Guardian, we're grappling with that. And so for that person, if they are bipolar and they are on a cycle of high and they can take on the world, is it because of that they're wanting to take that risk, or are they a high risk taker all the time? And it's us as professionals in whatever context we're in, how do we support someone through that? How do we work it out first, and then how do we support someone through that? That's the big question.
Before I pass it to Anthony, I'd like to thank him. I've just realised there's a new offering. Organisations that are introducing any of these technologies need lawyers and other professionals. In the 1990s, if an organisation wanted to network their offers, the lawyer's job was partly to work with other consultants and assess whether the software and the hardware package is going to do its job. It's the same thing, but very different new questions being asked about the degree of care being taken to determine whether the different competing softwares or systems have all of these checks done on them in terms of ethics, in terms of whether they are going to achieve the sort of objectives that they need to.
Thank you for the question. In the context of the financial advice and financial robo-advice, there's a court case already in the UK where a billionaire is suing a salesperson who sold him an AI to trade 24/7, which he met massive losses in the market. So it was sold that the autonomous system would be operating 24/7. It would be looking at all the data around the world when people are sleeping. in terms of what's happening to the marketplace, where to invest, and so forth and so forth. So this would be an interesting test case to see in terms of liability, who's responsible for the decision of a robot financial advisor in that place, and whether the salesperson oversaw the capacity or capability of the autonomous systems, whether it's sold to an individual who is knowledgeable about technology or the marketplace, or in your context, whether they could be bipolar, have a mental illness. So those are big question items that I think is going to come out from that sort of case. But I think we're just touching the tips of the iceberg, because how would an autonomous system or AI know your capacity in your background unless it's been specially programmed to actually test that before it starts engaging with you?
I look forward to the day when we have clairvoyant software.
I know.
But until that day, I think technology has to live in a human world. There is a series of challenges that we are going to have in mediating the impact of technology on humans, individuals, families, supporters. So the idea I'd like to leave you with as we move towards morning tea. So we're going to have half an hour of networking and morning tea and a chance to circulate and start talking about these things. Is that that our work, it's not only just information overload, our world is complexifying. People are being connected to these digital systems, and that is challenging the ability for someone to be able to cope and decide. So the thought I'd like to leave you with out of this segment of the morning is, okay, what should our priority be for strengthening individual and family capacity for dealing with complex decisions? Just think of the risks that we've touched on so far this morning. How do we support and strengthen the ability for individuals and families to cope with those emerging complexities, let alone the stuff they invent for themselves? And what are our roles as professionals, irrespective of our discipline and background, to support and strengthen client and family decision making? When someone asks me, Michael, what do you specialise in? You've got textbooks on estate planning, you've been around for all this time. What do you specialise in? I said, families. What do you do for families? That's so important. I help them row in the same boat. With that, you've got the chance of early intervention and bringing some of these complexities under management. But what is it that challenges that? The public perception of what professionals are good for. The idea of an ethical AI system, the idea of ethics in IT and system design, having an impact on civil rights and the ability for someone to transact their rights as a citizen. It's new thinking.
Yes.
So we need to think of, as we pursue these social outcomes, how do we make these kind of complexities accessible and manageable and safer to navigate? Safety will never be an absolute in this environment. We can only offer relative safety. But how can we, as professionals, respond more effectively to those challenges?